This is the Goggler Podcast. You're listening to Ask Us Anything. Bahir and Uma with you. And we have, this week, a whole bunch of questions, but we promised to get to them. For this episode, however, we decided that we're going to concentrate on one question, and one question alone, from Joel Morris, who sent us an email to podcast@goggler.my, and it is a question about censorship. It is a very big question, and we figured it's going to take up quite a bit of our time, so we thought we'd dedicate this entire episode to censorship. In the past, Bahir and I have spoken about censorship in Malaysia quite a bit. We've spoken about it in our reviews of movies. We've also spoken about it and addressed other questions that have arose in previous episodes of Ask Us Anything. But this is an all-encompassing question, and we thought we would use the time to clarify certain misconceptions, how we deal with censorship, and also what the LPF is really like, as far as we know. So, Joel asks, how do people who appreciate/care about filmmaking as an art in Malaysia deal with the ridiculous LPF censorship laws? I understand this is a question you get a lot based on your previous podcasts, but I just had to get this off my chest. You can obviously see how this makes piracy a viable alternative, encouraging some people not to go to the cinemas, considering it is easy to source quality Blu-rays for free. Like, the exclusivity of watching it in a Malaysian cinema is pointless. Films like Oppenheimer, Nosferatu, The Accountant 2, and Sinners are practically unwatchable in Malaysian cinemas. Hell, even P-13 films like MI8 and F1 are gonna have cuts. I do realize that Goggler used to post censorship reports saying despite the censorship, it's still rendered watchable. But is it really the standard we must get used to? Should we keep watching botched films on the big screen at full price? Because I think it's disrespectful to both filmmakers and the audience. I went on for far too long, but TLDR, my questions are, what is your advice to people who appreciate filmmaking in Malaysia that have to put up with censorship? You can tell us how you deal with it in your experience, how you guys feel about film censorship still being practiced to this day, and what is the foreseeable solution for this in your opinion? Because the more we look into it, there isn't one. Thank you for your question, Joel. But first, before we get into it, I think we need to clarify a few misconceptions, or errors, mind you. MI8 and F1 are unlikely to have any cuts. MI8 didn't have any cuts. Also, I watched a junket screening for Sinners, so I saw the uncut version, and then I saw it again in cinemas. It was the same for Oppenheimer and even Nosferatu, and I don't think those movies were unwatchable. In fact, Sinners barely had any cuts, and I think there was one cut that was done incredibly well that most of the Malaysian audience didn't even notice that there was a cut. With a movie like Oppenheimer and even Nosferatu, I think with Nosferatu as well, a lot of the people we spoke to who had never seen the movie before said that they didn't even notice the cuts that were taking place. And also, there were a lot fewer cuts. I think there were only 2 cuts, and we were expecting a lot more. With Oppenheimer, a Nolan film usually doesn't get released without his express approval with regards to cuts. And so there were 2 cuts in Oppenheimer, or one wasn't necessarily a cut. There was the sex scene when she was reading from the Bhagavad Gita, and then there was this scene when Florence Pugh was nude, but actually it was replaced with a black digital dress. So, with that, it was with Nolan's express approval. In fact, it was actually done by Paramount in the US for countries where these cuts are necessary. The Middle East, Malaysia, India, and so on. And so I think to say that these movies were rendered unwatchable is a bit of a stretch. That said, we're with you with regards to the general principle of censorship. Of course, we're against censorship of any sort, because we think that does, in fact, get in the way of an artist's vision of a specific movie. However, there are a couple of things, being a long-time citizen of Malaysia and the world, when it comes to things like censorship and how we deal with it. I think for Bahir and I, and I'm not speaking for Bahir, I think we've had this discussion many, many times, but I think for Bahir and I, one, we're so used to this conversation and we're so used to censorship that it has become an everyday part of our lives. I think a very good example is watching a movie like Cinema Paradiso, which is this ode to censorship, if you will, and how this young boy watching movies deals with all the kisses being cut and sex scenes being cut and how that affects his view on the world. And I think that's something a lot of Malaysians have kind of grown up with and become used to with regards to censorship. So much so that the conversation for the vast majority of Malaysians isn't even there. Most people don't even talk about it when they go to watch movies, which is why there isn't such a massive boycott of cinema that they're all going under, because the masses don't necessarily even care or talk about it.
I struggle to talk about this topic only because I'm 42 and I've learned to live with it. There's no point in raging against the tide of censorship or LPF in Malaysia. Let's not use the word censorship. Censorship is a big word and it can be misconstrued for different things. In my 42 years of life and probably the last 30 plus years of me being an active consumer of content and media in Malaysia, I have decided that I no longer will rage against the tide of LPF because you can't do anything about it. Joel's arguments are, I feel, misguided because I saw Nosferatu in Malaysian cinema. And yes, you miss 3 shots, I think, of her boobies. Did that really ruin your experience of this film, which is about a vampire and its lust for a woman, that you don't get 3 shots at the end of what's her name's breasts? I don't know how that can ruin your experience. How can watching Oppenheimer in a Malaysian cinema where the nude body of Florence Pugh splayed on a couch is covered by a digital dress that most people didn't even know was a digital dress, that even I didn't know was a digital dress until I went to Australia to watch the 70 milli print of it and realized that she was nude. How did that change your experience of the movie? So when Joel argues for artists' integrity, you're right, Uma. Christopher Nolan's films are specifically known for being tightly controlled by Christopher Nolan himself. Any cuts, any suggestions, any changes need to go through the director. And if the director approves it, does that not also then become the director's vision or approved vision for this film?
And of course, that boils down to the capitalist nature of Hollywood, right? And I think we need to go back to provide a brief history of censorship, not just necessarily within Hollywood, but also with regards to LPF, which is part of the reason why we don't necessarily rage against it constantly, because it has been an evolving beast. So with Hollywood, and this happens a lot of these movies get different versions. And I don't just mean versions that are cut and versions that are uncut. I mean versions that are shot differently by the director themselves. George Miller's Mad Max Fury Road had multiple versions. There were versions which he shot where the women weren't topless while strapped to the giant cars, because he knew that was the only way his movie was going to fly in certain parts of the world and therefore affect the box office. The remake of Ben-Hur had a different version for Southeast Asia and the Middle East, in countries where it's against the law to depict a prophet or any prophet. And so therefore, the version that came to Southeast Asia and the Middle East didn't show Jesus Christ. And this has happened a lot in Hollywood, and they actually make different versions of movies to make them commercially viable. Coming back to Malaysia, censorship here isn't a hard and fast thing. We have lived through many generations of censorship given our age. There was a time during the Najib administration especially when censorship was incredibly laxed. When we got movies like American Gangster and Django Unchained came to Malaysia uncut. You get to see Jamie Foxx's penis in all its glory uncut. And everything, the toplessness, all of that was uncut. And we were as shocked as everyone else because we were like, is someone in LPF sleeping on the job? Did this just miss them? What's going on? And of course, LPF, film censorship, all of that is greatly determined by who is in power and the government of the day and the conversation that society is having about such things. So fast forward to today. And I genuinely believe LPF is a lot more relaxed than they've ever been. So if you watch as many movies as we do in cinemas, you will realize that actually the vast majority of movies that get released in Malaysia are 100% uncut. Even the horror movies, the ones with lots of violence, they get an 18 rating and they're completely uncut. All of the language gets through, all of the fucks, all of the assholes, all of that stuff, all of the cunts, all of it gets through. So all of that stuff gets through depending on the rating, right? Because of course, it is a negotiation between LPF and the distributors as to what the rating should be, how much they should cut, etc., etc. Sometimes the film distributors themselves want cuts so they can get a lower rating so more people can actually go and watch the movie, so younger audiences can go and watch the movie. A lot of it ends up being economic decisions as opposed to just societal censorship decisions, right? And so all of this is taking place. But at the same time, as the cinema going audience, we are left unawares of the process of how this works. Now, LPF has been incredibly relaxed with regards to violence and gore. Yes, straight up sex is a big no-go. However, simulated sex seems to get through. There are little bits of nudity, I would say. Full frontal, maybe not, but you can see a bottom or two depending on the rating of the movie. And the hard no, the biggest no-go area is homosexuality. But that's only because of this current government. In the previous government, Everything Everywhere All at Once was released in cinemas here. That entire movie, the entire plot narrative of that movie centers around the relationship of a mother and her gay daughter, and there was no problem with that. But this current government seems to have a problem with homosexuality as depicted in films, and therefore, that's the big no-go area. And that's the thing that constantly gets cut or rejected from being screened in Malaysia. As for the reasons why, well, you're a clever person. You can figure it out.
When a person is advocating or is making the argument for piracy because of the potential for cuts, then I think you're doing much bigger harm than you think you are aiding yourself. Because Uma and I also remember at a time when piracy was so serious that a lot of movies just wouldn't show up here because the distributors would just go, oh, people are just going to pirate this. There's no reason for me to bring in, spending the money, marketing it and pushing it and going through the rigmarole of getting government approvals and licensing and permitting and all that stuff. What is the point when people are just going to pirate it? What is the point of bringing in a Fox Searchlight movie or an A24 movie when there are so few people who will go to the cinema to watch an A24 movie, and most of them would pirate it anyway? So I think we're coming from a place of a little bit of censorship is better than not seeing the film at all.
On the big screen.
If you feel like watching Oppenheimer on the big screen in Malaysia was unwatchable, Uma and I know that there was serious consideration from the distributor to even bring that movie in because they think people won't go watch a movie like this. And not because of the censorship issues.
No, because it was a 3-hour talky movie about the man who invented the nuclear bomb, right?
Yeah. So, I think if you think piracy is the solution, you're essentially screwing everybody.
And it's because of that we encourage people to go and watch these movies on the big screen, despite even the slightest bit of censorship. For me, my logic is that we need to get as many people excited about film. Remember, LPF and the government are still responding to society. For better or for worse, we live in an incredibly religious and conservative society. The people like Bahir and myself who are staunchly against censorship and who have no problem watching hardcore sex and full frontal nudity on screen are in the minority. And so, if there is a critical mass of Malaysians who are able to watch this stuff and go, hey, look, my morality isn't affected. It hasn't destroyed my children's lives, etc., etc. The more and more people come to that realization, then the government and the LPF will be forced to change. That can only happen if people continue to educate themselves by watching these things and watching these movies.
I think if you want to be treated like an adult, you have to act like one. And piracy is not acting like an adult. I can say this in 2025 because I remember in 1995 when I had to go to the DVD shop to buy a Fellini film. I remember in 2005 when I had to go to a DVD shop to go and buy a film that was never screened here. I want to inform people that when a movie shows up in Malaysia, and if you call yourself a film fan, unless it is unwatchable, in which case we will tell you, we've done it before, you should go watch it in the cinema. I mean, I kind of take personal umbrage at Joel saying that movies like MI8 and F1 are gonna have cuts. We've seen MI8 and there are no cuts. I feel like if you say these things and you're already priming yourself to not go and watch it, I feel you're doing yourself a disservice because MI8 needs to be seen on the big screen. And I don't care how big your TV is. It is not IMAX big. And MI8 and F1 are two movies that deserve the big screen. If you're just going to watch it at home on your TV or on your phone or on your laptop, then you're not really a film fan either, are you?
But I think this is a misconception that a lot of people have about the state of censorship in Malaysia. And I think that stems from not watching enough movies in the cinema. Because, like I said, it ebbs and flows. And the vast majority of films are actually uncut.
Yeah.
And to answer your question with regards to advice to people who appreciate filmmaking but have to put up with censorship, you're listening to two of them. Like, we love filmmaking. We love films. Bahir was a filmmaker. We've spent our life dedicated to this craft. And I don't think our appreciation of the craft was in any way affected by the content that we were exposed to growing up. And mind you, growing up, almost everything we watched was censored, especially if it was on the big screen, especially if it was on TV. The vast majority of my film education came from RTM and TV3 when they used to show all of these movies on a Saturday, on a Friday, on a Sunday night. And that's when we used to watch it. And of course, there used to be cuts. And of course, there used to be censored bits. And just like the kid at the end of Cinema Paradiso, when he's all grown up, sitting in that cinema and watching all of the uncut bits of the movie, when we finally grew up and got a chance to watch it on DVD and Blu-ray, and we were like, whoa, there was that whole bit that I missed in the movie. And so I don't think it affected our appreciation of the craft in any way. And the reason I say that is also because I don't think anything, and Bahir said this already, but I don't think anything beats the big screen experience. If I have to put up with 10 seconds of a 3-hour movie being cut, as opposed to watching it on my phone or my laptop or TV at home, I would much rather put up with those 10 seconds being cut, because for me, nothing beats that cinema, that communal experience, right?
There's also something you said earlier about how the LPF censorship and the cuts are a conversation between the distributor and the censorship board. There was no way in hell Anora was going to show up in Malaysia. No way, right? Aside from the fact that that movie is littered with nudity, that movie was also made for a very niche audience. The fact that that movie didn't do gangbusters around the world implies that it wouldn't have done well in the Malaysian cinema, aside from the nudity. So that was an economic decision by a distributor somewhere who said that it's not worth screening it here. And I accept that. And that's okay. Like, would I like to have seen that on the big screen? Of course. But if you're saying that it's not worth supporting the cinema or not worth going to the cinema because there is the threat that an F-bomb is going to be cut, then I think your concerns are misguided.
It's difficult to make a blanket claim that censorship is disrespectful to both filmmakers and the audience because it is a complex situation. A lot of the time, the filmmakers themselves, like we said before, censor their movies. And so therefore, it's very difficult to know what the source of the censorship is. As for a solution, I think censorship becomes less viable as society continues to grow and educate themselves and evolve. And the only way that can happen is if all of us push that envelope. Is if we keep going to the cinema and we watch these movies and we talk about these movies and we show people that it's not going to harm them in any way. There is a wild conversation that goes on out in the Malaysian web sphere, right, and social media sphere with regards to the kind of content that parents want to show their children and that Malaysians should be allowed to watch. And the interesting thing is, a lot of that is driven from the ground up. I think if you follow what's going on Facebook and Twitter, especially with regards to children's programming, and how Malaysian parents completely lose their shit whenever there's a gay character or a trans character, and how they should not allow our children to be watching this, etc., you can see why the government and the LPF respond the way they do. A lot of the time, they just don't want the trouble.
Can I just also say that isn't an exclusively Malaysia problem?
It's not. Disney are doing the same thing.
The American heartlands, the Northern Englishmen, all made noise when Lightyear came out and there was a gay character in there.
And Disney has responded to that because they released Inside Out 2 and they saw how it made $1 billion. And now there is this unofficial policy to kind of make movies and their TV shows as, in inverted commas, universal as possible, forgetting, of course, that homosexuality or transgendered experiences are universal experiences too. But that doesn't matter, right? It's all about the money. And of course, there were stories that came out about Inside Out 2 and how the show's creators were told to make the character less gay or come off as less gay. They released a series, Win or Lose, on Disney Plus, where an entire character who was trans had their storyline cut from the series. And if you watch Lilo and Stitch in cinemas now, the director was asked the question at the press junket with regards to one of the characters who was dressed as a woman in the cartoon, as to why that wasn't the case in live action, to which the director replied, "I tried." And so it isn't a uniquely Malaysian problem. I think society and governments and corporations in the American sense tend to respond and tend to fuel each other. And so the solution to censorship is actually addressing society's issues with it. And I think the more of us who are of a certain mind, I don't want to call it liberal, I think of a certain mind, the more of us of a certain mind who speak out about it, who kind of lean into educating people about such things, the better it is for censorship, for society, for everything. But I think if we just keep quiet and go, oh, well, I'm going to boycott this because there are a few cuts, I don't think any progress happens. And I think that's why Bahir and I are constantly having these conversations, and not just with our listeners, but, with students that we meet, with the next generation of filmmakers. We're constantly pushing them to think about these things because that's the only way things will ever change. But yeah, as for Malaysia, it's all cyclical, man. There were times when censorship was so lax. I mean, it was a fucking golden age where we would get anything and everything. And then, unfortunately, things changed over the pandemic. I mean, like just before the pandemic, it was fucking amazing. We would get all kinds of movies, indie movies, talkies, big blockbusters, and distributors had no problem bringing it in. Censorship was a lot more laxed. But of course, the government changed, ideologies changed, different things happened, the pandemic happened, and then we're suddenly living in a different world.
We both remember a time when violence was censored in Malaysian cinemas. Horror movies would have cuts because it would be literally the excuse would be it is too scary. We grew up at a time when the U rating and 18 ratings were introduced. Remember 18PL and 18SX and 18PG? They would have these ratings but still have cuts in the films.
And also, I mean, we have no idea where America is going to go.
Yeah.
At this point, they're banning books left, right, and center. You can't teach your kids certain things. I don't know how it's going to affect Hollywood, at least for the next 4 years. Under Trump, we have no idea what that means. Big corporations who make these movies are stepping back all of the stuff that they had pushed for because they're afraid of losing government support. They're afraid of mergers not going through. Major news corporations are being censored. The editor of 60 Minutes just quit. I think the producer quit as well. And so we don't know what's going to end up in America. Our closest neighbor, Singapore, has a rating system which they enforce. And there is less censorship in Singapore. However, homosexuality is still a thing that they cut in Singapore, despite giving it a much higher rating. So, Call Me By Your Name, for example, I went to see it in Singapore because obviously it wasn't going to come to Malaysia, but I went to see it in Singapore and it was 18. I think it was the highest rating, 21 or 18 in Singapore. But the gay love scenes were edited out. I think it was the same with Wolf of Wall Street. I think there were certain scenes that were still cut despite the 18 rating because Singapore is also a very religious and conservative society. Bahir and I went to see Lightyear in Singapore, and because of a 3-second scene featuring 2 gay characters in passing, the movie was rated 15. And so kids were not allowed to go and see Lightyear. So yeah, every country practices different things in response to either what society believes or what they think society believes, right? And it's a really slow process. But I will say this. If you've constantly followed, like we have, cinema in Malaysia, I can tell you that things are getting better. Yes, there are some things that aren't great, for sure. But I think if we keep pushing in the right direction, things will only get better. The solution is not to kind of sit back and whinge and do nothing about it. I think the solution is actually to engage with every part of what is going on.
Can I also just bring up one fact that a lot of people don't know? LPF is a body within the Home Ministry. LPF, Lembaga Penafpisan Film, or in English, the Censorship Board, is actually manned by, I think, 10 or 15 people, who generally are all former government civil servants, who are, and this will blow your mind, nominated. You can write in. There's a form online. If you can find it, I can find it. I know where it is. There is a form online for you to apply to become a member of LPF, to essentially control the censorship of the country moving forward. So if you are a former government civil servant, or if your parents are a former government civil servant, I encourage you to help them fill up this form. Because all they have to do is get into a panel of 4 people and watch movies and say which parts offend them. You want to become a force for change? This is how you do it. Apply to become a member on the LPF board, because you can do that.
The document itself, we have the book. There's a document, the LPF guidelines. The document itself is purposefully vague. There are specific things that are very, very on point. Like, if you do anything that insults Islam or religion, for example, yes, that is a big no-no and that is very specific and you cannot do that. However, with regards to sex and violence and language, and yes, there's a list of words that are unacceptable, but of course, a lot of those words actually get through these days. All of that is purposefully vague because they want to leave it in the hands of those making the decision.
Because it's all an interpretation thing. So, for example, words. This is something that is worth discussing. Words. Fuck, when used as a sexual connotation, i.e., I'm going to fuck you tonight, is bad, censored completely. I'm going to fuck you up, as in violence, completely fine. Again, asshole. Kiss my asshole as like an insult, fine. Use the word asshole in a sexual term, completely wrong. Again, having been a content creator, having been a filmmaker, having had to deal with these things, that vagueness and or clarity, depending on who you side with, is beautiful, because you can then sit with the 4 people on that LPF board and say, oh, well, actually, he didn't mean it sexually. It's 2 guys who are having fun. These are 2 guys who are trying to weird each other out by pretending who can be the gayest in public. So you can have these conversations, and if they agree with you, great, fine, sorted, no cuts. In fact, I also know of stories where a film has been submitted to the LPF board and then the distributor didn't like the subsequent report. They would just wait and resubmit it in hopes of getting a different group of 4 people who might be more liable and pliable to your concerns. It's a negotiation. It's a discussion. It's not a hard and fast rule. And I think in a world that we live in right now, I think for both supporters and non-supporters of censorship, I think that's the best you can hope for. That there will be a discussion about this, that context is mentioned and noted, and then you can then move forward.
For me, the biggest misconception from your question, Joel, is that the vast majority of movies in Malaysia are completely uncut and completely uncensored. And yes, there are some big movies with notable sequences that end up getting cut in Malaysia. But even that is an interesting proposition because sometimes we hear that the movies come pre-cut out of the United States. And so the LPF has nothing to do with it. It's already been cut by the filmmakers or the studios because they want the movie to get released. That's another conversation completely about artistic integrity and capitalism and art and commerce and where the twain shall come into conflict, etc., etc. And then, of course, there's the final question of how we feel about censorship still being practiced to this day. Unfortunately, it is an inescapable thing. Like Bahir said right up the top, it's been practiced forever. As long as there have been humans and as long as someone felt offended by something, censorship has been around in different ways. And I think we just have to find ways to navigate it. And if we really, truly feel strongly about something, we need to find ways to speak out about it and make our point heard, right?
For me, if anything, I think if there was ever a discussion about filmmaking as maybe not necessarily an art form, but as a dying form of business in Malaysia, I'd say the thing to discuss is actually entertainment tax. But that's a whole other podcast.
Oh, for sure. We should talk about entertainment tax, actually, because that's fucking up filmmakers a lot more than censorship is.
Absolutely. I think censorship is not the problem. I think, yes, there will be censors and there will be censored sequences. But I think if you really want to talk about what's fucking up and or ruining the industry, and I'm not just talking about local filmmakers, I'm talking also about the exhibitors and their business, is entertainment tax. I think that's a more pressing issue.
All right. Well, that was a fun chat. We hope we addressed some of your concerns, Joel. Do reach out with more thoughts if you have them. Let us know what you think. I mean, we dislike censorship, but hey, we're trying to fight it every day, right? Let us know your thoughts on censorship in Malaysia or anywhere in the world for that matter. Keep those questions coming in. You know how to reach out. We're on Instagram on Goggler MY. You can also email us on podcast at goggler.my like Joel did. Or you can send us a WhatsApp on the Goggler hotline 012-524-5208. Thank you so much for listening. This is the Goggler Podcast.